Hey guys, tonight we step back into the bustling streets of medieval London, where the air is thick with a mix of enticing aromas and, well, some less appealing ones. You probably won't survive this without a strong stomach, but hey, that's the charm of history, right? Picture yourself tramping through narrow alleys crowded with shouting vendors, clattering carts, and the clamor of horseshoes on cobblestones. The smells hit you first: fresh baked bread, sizzling meat, smoky fires, and beneath it all, the unmistakable whiff of refuse and unwashed bodies. This is the city where people squeezed life into every moment, grabbing whatever food they could on the go, because sitting down for a proper meal was often a luxury. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see who's joining the medieval snack adventure tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you trudge down a busy street, you're instantly surrounded by a carnival of noises. The hawkers calling out their wares, the clinking of coins, children weaving between legs, and the occasional bark of a dog scavenging for scraps. Every corner holds a food stall or a vendor's cart, and the choices range from fresh loaves of bread to roasted chestnuts, or something a bit more questionable if you're feeling brave. Historians often argue whether medieval London was more fragrant or foul at any given moment. But one thing's for sure: the jumble of smells painted a vivid portrait of city life. The rich, yeasty scent of bakeries spilled out from doorways, mingling with the acrid smoke of hearth fires and the sharp tang of pickled fish. Then, underneath it all, was the city's undeniable reality: piles of rubbish, open drains, and the ever-present scent of human and animal waste. The concept of sanitation was still very much evolving. So, you're advised to keep a handkerchief handy. People who lived here relied on quick, portable food to keep pace with the city's demands. You wouldn't find many leisurely feasts on the street, more like grabbing a bite between errands, work, or while socializing. In many ways, this was the original fast food, centuries before the Golden Arches made it famous. Vendors specialized in simple, filling snacks that could be eaten standing up or on the move. The city's food landscape was layered with class distinctions too, though the humble street snacks often blurred those lines, shared by merchants, laborers, and sometimes even the well-to-do who fancied a quick nibble. The sensory overload wasn't just about taste and smell. Your eyes dart across colorful stalls draped in cloth, the glint of copper pots, and the darkened shapes of fish drying in the sun. You can almost hear the sizzling of meats on spits and the rhythmic thump of a baker's peel pulling hot pies from the oven. Meanwhile, the crowd pulses like a living thing, each person a thread in the tangled tapestry of medieval urban life. Interestingly, scholars debate the extent to which these food smells shaped social interactions. Did certain aromas mark territory or class? Some suggest that the more pungent smells were a form of urban camouflage, disguising less pleasant realities beneath a veneer of daily hustle. Others argue it was a sign of pride, vendors drawing customers with the unmistakable scent of freshly cooked food, no matter how rustic. In the end, walking these streets was a feast for your senses, if you could stomach it. The layers of scent, sound, and sight were not just background noise. They told the story of a city alive with survival, commerce, and the constant search for a quick, satisfying bite. You push forward from the crowded streets into the pulse of medieval London's daily grind, where grabbing a quick bite wasn't just convenience, it was survival. The idea of fast food, as we know it today, didn't exist. But that didn't mean people weren't on the lookout for something to eat between their endless errands and backbreaking work. Street snacks were the medieval version of takeaway, portable, affordable, and often surprisingly filling. You might spot someone clutching a hand pie, warm and slightly greasy, or biting into a chunk of bread smeared with cheese or honey. Vendors specialized in these quick eats, sometimes called drinks or meats in the old records. But nothing was fast in the modern sense, more like grab and go at a pace that suited a world without cars or clocked breaks. The city's population was booming, which meant demand for easy food was rising. You could hardly expect a merchant or laborer to sit down for a full meal when the marketplace was calling and coins were counting. This is why so many relied on things like baked goods, salted fish, or dried fruits. Items that could last a bit without spoiling and didn't require utensils or plates. Historians still argue whether some snacks were truly considered junk food or just necessities dressed up with a bit of spice. After all, medieval diets were shaped heavily by what was affordable and available, and the idea of nutrition wasn't nearly as scientific as today. What counted was that food kept you going, and preferably didn't make you ill. That delicate balance was a daily gamble. You can imagine the scents mingling in the air, the smoky tang of grilled meats, the sweet allure of honeyed pastries, and the sharp saltiness of pickled snacks. Vendors knew how to attract attention with their cries, hawking pies hot and savory, fresh cheese curds, or candied nuts fresh from the fire. The market square was a theater of food, each vendor playing their part. One quirky tidbit: some street sellers peddled fried fish, caught fresh from the Thames, a precursor to what centuries later would become the famous fish and chips. Except back then, the chips were often just bread, or some kind of root vegetable roasted over coals. Potatoes hadn't yet made their debut in England. The idea of deep-fried snacks was beginning to take root, although the medieval palate was still exploring which fats were best for frying. Another fringe fact is that some fast foods were actually leftovers reimagined. Thick stews or porridges might be cooled, shaped into cakes or patties, and fried up for sale the next day. It's like the medieval version of reheated takeout, though with less microwave and more open flame. Of course, you're also stepping into a scene where sanitation was questionable, so some snacks came with risks. Historians still debate how much medieval Londoners knew about food safety, and whether certain foods were seen as risky or just part of normal life. Remember, the city's water supply was often polluted, and many relied on dried or salted foods, partly because fresh items spoiled quickly. From humble meat pies to sweet honey cakes, medieval fast food was about practicality wrapped in tradition. It was food designed to meet the frantic pace of city life and the realities of limited technology. And sometimes that meant eating whatever you could carry in one hand while navigating a crowd of pedestrians, carts, and the occasional stray animal. So, next time you grab a snack on the run, remember you're channeling a very old habit, one born in the noisy, smelly, and wonderfully chaotic streets of medieval London. The aroma draws you in long before you spot the source. There's something comforting, even decadent, in the scent of warm pastry mingled with savory fillings. In medieval London, the humble pie was more than just a treat. It was practically a food group, affordable, filling, and easily portable. Pies were the go-to snack for people of all classes. But don't expect buttery, flaky crusts filled with apple or pumpkin. Oh no. The medieval pie was something else entirely. You shuffle up to a vendor's stall, where rows of golden brown crusts rest atop steaming trays. The crusts, often thick and tough, aren't meant to be eaten. They're called coffins or huff paste, and they serve a practical purpose. Keep the contents from spoiling and your fingers from getting burned. The filling, it could be anything from minced beef and onions to spiced chicken or even eel, depending on the season and your social standing. You scoop it out with a spoon or fingers if you're feeling medieval about it. Interestingly, historians still argue whether people actually ate the crusts or just used them like edible Tupperware. For the wealthy, the pastry might be thrown away or given to the poor as alms. For everyone else, it might be dunked in broth or wine to soften it up and wring a second use out of the dried-out casing. Not exactly the croissant experience. Pies were as much about preservation as they were about taste. A sealed meat pie could last several days, even in questionable conditions, which made them a smart option for travelers, workers, or anyone without a kitchen. Plus, the mixture of spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, wasn't just for flavor. Many of these were believed to aid digestion or mask the less than fresh nature of the meat. A little mold, just scrape it off. You're fine. And pies weren't just for lunch or dinner. You could find sweet versions too, filled with figs, raisins, or dried plums, often spiced with cinnamon and sweetened with honey. These weren't desserts as we know them today, but more like energy bars for the medieval commuter. Sticky, dense, and intensely flavorful. One quirky twist. Some pies were designed as performance pieces. Yes, you heard that right. Wealthy households might prepare gigantic subtleties, elaborate dishes in disguise, including pies that open to reveal live birds or frogs. Think of it as the medieval version of dinner theater. You're just hoping your vendor's pie doesn't come with a surprise squawk. As you nibble on your warm pocket of meat and spices, you might notice that pies also served a political role. During feast days or coronations, giant pies were presented as symbols of abundance and prosperity. They weren't always eaten, but they made a statement. Look how much we can stuff into a crust. Even the materials used in pies varied. The rich might enjoy their fillings encased in refined flour crusts with eggs and butter, while the poor made do with coarse meal and water doughs, baked rock hard to stand upright. Not to mention, the crusts could be reused. That's right. Your coffin might have had more than one life, especially if you didn't care too much about crumbs or hygiene. You start to get the picture. Pies were everywhere. They were the medieval multi-tool of meals, preservation, portability, presentation, and above all, they tasted like comfort, even if sometimes that comfort came with a side of mystery meat. You shift your attention from pies to something a bit simpler, yet just as essential. The backbone of nearly every meal in medieval London, bread. But not all loaves were created equal. Bread was more than just food. It was a social signal, a reflection of class. and occasionally a source of scandal. You might not think twice about toast today, but back then, the type of bread in your hands could mark your place in the world. Picture yourself queuing at a bustling bakery tucked between an alehouse and a fishmonger's shop. The baker stands behind a large wooden counter dusted in flour, pulling loaves from a blackened stone oven that radiates enough heat to keep the tiny room steamy even in winter. The smell? Irresistible. Warm yeast, nutty grains, and the faint tang of sourdough ferment, if you're lucky. Now, if you've got coin to spare, you ask for manchette, a soft, white loaf made from finely sifted wheat flour. It's light, fluffy, and a clear sign that you're doing all right in life. But if your purse is light, you'll end up with something like a maslin loaf, a gritty, darker bread made from a mix of rye, barley, or whatever grains were handy. These loaves were tougher, denser, and had a chewiness that might take effort and patience. Interestingly, bread wasn't just sold by weight. It was governed by the assize of bread, a law meant to regulate price and quality. Bakers could be fined, or even publicly shamed, if their loaves didn't match up to the standards. Still, that didn't stop a few clever cheats from hollowing out loaves to reduce weight, or mixing in sawdust or chalk to stretch the flour. Historians still argue how widespread such frauds really were. But London's crowded bakeries certainly gave space for the occasional scam. A quirky footnote? Some households baked their own bread, but most people relied on communal ovens. These were large, open brick kilns where you'd bring your dough, often marked with your initials or a distinct stamp so you didn't get someone else's sad, flat experiment. And while it may sound cozy, these communal ovens were hotspots of gossip, bickering, and the occasional charred disaster. And let's not forget trencher bread, the edible plate of the medieval world. Thick slabs of stale bread used to hold stews or meats, then tossed to the poor or animals when the meal ended. It's not the most glamorous use for a loaf, but it worked. You wouldn't want to eat it too early, though. It needed to be dry enough to hold up under a ladle of hot pottage without turning into mush. Bread was also tied to religion. Certain types of bread were reserved for holy days or feasts, made with extra butter, spices, or fruit. On fasting days, bread might be your only allowed indulgence unless you had a flexible confessor and a creative kitchen. There's also debate among scholars about whether the medieval poor consumed enough bread to sustain them daily, or whether they substituted it often with beans or grain-based porridges. The answer likely varied by season, by trade, and by luck. But one thing is clear. Bread wasn't just food. It was identity. You cradle your loaf carefully as you wander down the street, the crust warm against your palms. It's not flashy, and it might leave crumbs down your tunic, but it's yours. In a world of fleeting comfort, a good loaf of bread is a soft promise of survival. You chew thoughtfully on your dense, crusty bread as you step into the swirl of the fish market, where smells hit you like a gust from the Thames itself, briny, sharp, and a little too honest. Here in medieval London, fish wasn't just a dietary choice, it was an obligation. With nearly half the calendar made up of fast days when eating meat was forbidden, fish filled a major gap. But this wasn't a world of grilled salmon and sushi rolls. No, your options leaned more toward salted herring, dried stockfish, and the occasional lucky eel. Fishmongers yell over the clamor of carts and foot traffic, hawking their goods with impressive flair. You edge closer to a stall, where slabs of grayish pickled herring glisten beside small wooden barrels. Some fish are fresh, just caught upriver, but many have traveled far, dried stiff as planks or packed in thick layers of salt. These aren't fancy delicacies, they're staples, and you learn to chew around the bones. One mainstream fact: Londoners consumed staggering amounts of fish per year. Records show entire shiploads of herring, cod, and eel arriving at the city's ports. The church required fish days, Fridays, Lent, and a slew of other holy observances, on which red meat was banned. So, naturally, fish became the go-to workaround. And let's be honest, it wasn't always pleasant. The smell of old salted fish stored in hot weather, that'll stick with you longer than a plague memory. A quirky tidbit floats to the surface sometimes. Fish didn't even mean fish. Beavers, due to their aquatic habits, were occasionally classified by church authorities as fish, and thus okay to eat during Lent. Same went for barnacle geese, which were believed to grow on driftwood in the sea. Historians still argue whether these classifications were theological loopholes or genuine misunderstandings of biology. But either way, it's a bizarre justification that medieval Londoners didn't question too much. If it swam, floated, or looked vaguely fish-like, into the pot it went. And yes, eel was everywhere. You can't walk a block in 14th century London without spotting it. Smoked eel, jellied eel, eel pie. Eels were abundant in the Thames and relatively easy to catch. They became such a core food that people paid rent with them. Imagine slipping a pouch of slimy eels across a landlord's table. Here's this month's rent, sir. For the wealthier classes, fresh fish might come from private ponds or high-end vendors dealing in river trout or imported delicacies like sturgeon or lamprey. These were dressed up with saffron, vinegar, and spices, served at feasts to applause and mild indigestion. But for the average Londoner, it was more likely to be a slab of cold, smoked haddock, or dried cod beaten with a mallet to make it edible. Stockfish, in particular, was legendary for its toughness, imported from Scandinavia. These bone-dry cod had to be soaked for hours, sometimes days, before becoming chewable. A hungry apprentice might gnaw on it like jerky, hoping his teeth held out. Of course, no proper fish stall was complete without shellfish. Oysters were abundant and cheap, especially for the poor. Today's luxury item was once the snack of the street, piled into pails and eaten by the handful. It wasn't uncommon to find oyster shells discarded in alleys, courtyards, or even mixed into building foundations. A medieval version of litter, but at least it sparkled. Historians debate whether Londoners appreciated the nutritional benefits of fish or simply tolerated it out of necessity. There's some evidence that people believed certain fish had medicinal qualities, eel for stamina, trout for complexion, but more often it came down to availability, affordability, and whether it was a Friday. You shuffle past the stalls, avoiding a fishmonger wringing out his apron and a cat pawing at a stack of crab shells. Somewhere, someone's boiling mussels in a grimy pot, and the salty steam drifts over the square. You're not sure if it smells delicious or slightly threatening, but like everything else in this city, fish had a place. It filled bellies, followed rules, and found its way into nearly every pot. Whether fresh from the docks or months old and salted into submission, fish was medieval London's fallback plan. If meat was banned, bread was gone, or money was tight, you always had eel. The street curves and your nose twitches. Something sweet lingers in the air. A warm, spicy aroma, clinging to the breeze like a promise. You follow it, weaving past carts and noisy children, until you reach a small table with a wide wooden tray covered in golden, glistening lumps. You found the gingerbread seller. Now, hold on. Wipe away any image of soft, frosted cookies shaped like men with gumdrop buttons. Medieval gingerbread is its own beast. Chewy, dense, often dark, and more spice than sweet. It's somewhere between a granola bar and an edible brick. But to the medieval palate, accustomed to savory stews and stale bread, it might as well be candy. You watch the seller cut it into squares with a small knife, each piece dusted with a bit of sugar or maybe covered with gold leaf. Yes, actual gold for special events. The base is a paste of breadcrumbs mixed with honey or treacle and spiced with ginger, cinnamon, and black pepper. Some recipes call for wine, others sneak in saffron for color. You bite into a piece and it sticks to your teeth, warm and peppery, with a slow burn that makes your eyes water just slightly. Delightful. This wasn't just a snack. Gingerbread, in its many forms, was medicine. According to medieval apothecaries, ginger warmed the body, soothed the stomach, and improved circulation. A little sweet with your prescription? Don't mind if you do. Wealthy households kept their own spice blends, stored in locked boxes, often worth more than the silverware. You were basically eating treasure. Here's a quirky twist. At fairs and festivals, gingerbread was shaped into animals, saints or hearts, especially during Valentine's Day. Children bought them, lovers exchanged them, and sometimes they were even sold with bawdy little poems pressed into the dough. So much for subtlety. But don't be fooled into thinking this was common fare. Spices were expensive, imported from distant lands, India, the Middle East, North Africa. They came by caravan and ship, changing hands a dozen times before reaching the London docks. Even a pinch of cloves or nutmeg meant someone, somewhere, risked pirates or desert heat to get it here. Historians still argue whether average Londoners had access to these spices, often or only on rare occasions. The answer likely depended on who you knew and what they were willing to smuggle. In the late afternoon, you spot a wealthier merchant nibbling a delicate wafer, spiced with ginger and rosewater, likely made by his cook in a tiled kitchen. Meanwhile, a young apprentice sneaks a corner of spiced bread from a stall, and a widow lingers nearby, trading a few farthings for a slice wrapped in parchment. Spiced sweets weren't just for joy, they were moments of escape. A reminder that life, no matter how grimy or plague-prone, still had flavor. And then there were sugar lozenges, tiny, hard candies infused with herbs or fruit, sold by apothecaries as both treat and tonic. Licorice root and anise were common choices. They promised to settle nerves, freshen breath, or cure spleen wind. Whether they worked or not, up for debate. But they gave your mouth something to do besides chewing on salted fish. There's even evidence of street performances using candy. Traveling performers might toss sweetened nuts or candied seeds into a crowd before launching into a tale or song. And the crowd, absolutely into it. Medieval Londoners didn't have Netflix, but they had candied fennel and puppet shows. As you let the last bit of gingerbread melt slowly on your tongue, you realize you're not just eating. You're participating in a quiet rebellion against cold mornings, against meatless Fridays, against the drab sameness of daily life. With one spicy, sticky bite, you're part of a centuries-old tradition, finding comfort, celebration, and even hope in a mouthful of sugar and spice. You turn a corner and nearly collide with a man hauling a basket of pies again, but this time there's a distinctly gamey smell in the air. Not poultry, not fish, something a little stranger. And then you spot the sign. A picture of a rabbit and a ferret sharing a pastry. Welcome to the world of exotic street meats. Don't let the term exotic mislead you. In medieval London, that just meant animals you probably wouldn't expect to see inside a crust. Hedgehog pie? Yes. Roasted swan? Definitely. If you had royal connections. Badger stew? On rare occasion. And let's not forget the long-standing tradition of stuffing almost anything into a pastry to make it last longer and taste, well, edible. You're drawn toward a stall displaying various skewered meats, roasting over a small charcoal fire. One of them looks suspiciously like a squirrel. The vendor sees your hesitation and grins. Fresh from the forest, tastes like chicken, but angrier. You're not sure if that's a joke or a warning. Here's the thing. Meat was prized, expensive, and regulated. There were entire guilds dedicated to butchery, and laws that dictated who could sell what and where. Deer, for instance, were mostly off limits to commoners, reserved for the king and his pals. But rabbits, pigeons, rats, that was fair game, literally. You could trap what you needed if you knew how, and if no one was watching. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval London had an entire legal structure to control meat quality and hygiene. The butchers of Eastcheap were known for their gruesome efficiency. And inspectors, called alacunners or garblers, depending on the product, checked food for rot or fraud. Meat that failed inspection might be dumped in the Thames, or, if someone was feeling less ethical, quietly sold to a less reputable pie maker on the outskirts of town. And here's your quirky detail of the day. Roast peacock was a feast centerpiece among the rich, often served with feathers reattached for dramatic flair. They weren't the tastiest birds, tough and oily, but they looked magnificent. Swans got similar treatment, as did cranes, porpoises, and even dolphins, all technically served during religious fasting, thanks to their semi-aquatic lifestyles. Historians still argue how frequently such dishes were actually eaten outside ceremonial banquets, but written menus do hint at a love for theatrical dinners. Meanwhile, the poorer folk got creative. A popular street meat was blackbird, cooked into pies, yes, like the nursery rhyme. Other options included thrush, lark, or starling. Pigeon stew was cheap and filling, especially if thickened with ale or mixed with whatever root vegetables were available. Even cat and dog were rumored to have been eaten in desperate times. Though records on this are rare and often veiled in euphemisms, you stop near a vendor carving thin slices off what he claims is a forest pie, which includes partridge, rabbit, and something he vaguely calls ground fowl. You don't ask. He hands it to you wrapped in a bit of cabbage leaf. The meat is peppery, a little greasy, but hot and satisfying. And then there were awful dishes, organs and innards that wealthier citizens passed over. You could find stalls selling tongue, heart, tripe, or liver, often boiled or fried, heavily seasoned to hide the intensity. "Nothing goes to waste," they'd say, and they meant it. Even pig's ears were considered a snack, especially when fried crisp like chips. As you nibble, you hear a group of children chanting a rhyme about kitchen thieves, mocking those who stole meat scraps from butcher shops. Food theft was common, but punishable. One recorded punishment involved a man being dragged through the streets with the stolen meat tied around his neck. Humiliation and hygiene violation in one neat punishment. At times, vendors mixed meats with breadcrumbs or flour to stretch the volume, especially for pies or sausages. The honesty of what was inside? Dubious at best. One London satirist joked that a man once found his missing cat baked into a mystery pasty. It's a dark joke, probably. You walk on, warm pie in hand, thinking about just how adaptable and desperate medieval cuisine could be. Whether you were gnawing roasted hedgehog by candlelight or spooning up squirrel stew with ale, one truth remains clear. If it had legs, wings, or just moved suspiciously fast through your alleyway, someone in London had probably tried to eat it. The shadows stretch long over the market. But the clatter of pans and voices doesn't fade, it simply shifts. Evening brings out different foods, a little warmer, a little greasier, with the sort of smells that settle into your clothes. You hear the unmistakable hiss of hot oil, meeting batter and drift toward it. You're about to meet one of the most beloved medieval snacks, fritters. Forget your modern funnel cakes. These fritters are more rugged and far more mysterious. They're blobs of battered dough, sometimes filled, sometimes plain, always fried in fat that's probably seen better days. The smell? Irresistible. A mix of onion, meat, and something sweet you can't quite place. You find the stand, just a plank nailed across two barrels, a pot of bubbling oil at its center, and a woman with arms like tree trunks, flipping lumps of golden batter with a two-pronged fork. You watch her drop something into the batter, a slice of apple, a bit of cheese. It's hard to tell. Then, with practiced ease, she flicks it into the pot. Sizzle, steam, magic. After a minute or so, out it comes, golden and dripping, onto a wooden plank dusted with what might be salt or sugar. You're offered one. You take it. You burn your tongue. Now here's a tasty historical fact. Fritters were among the most popular and democratic of medieval street foods. Easy to make, quick to sell, and endlessly adaptable. They could be sweet, apple or fig, or savory, filled with leeks, cheese, or even leftover fish. Recipes from the time suggest everything from battered herbs to slices of meat or offal. The fritter was a blank canvas, and the medieval friar was the artist with a vat of boiling lard. One of the more unusual versions was the marrow fritter. Yes, bone marrow. Scooped out and mixed with herbs and breadcrumbs, then dipped in batter and fried, rich, fatty, decadent. It was sold by vendors outside taverns, offering a quick way to soak up too much ale. Others included pea fritters, or ones made from leftover pottage thickened with flour. And let's not skip the batter itself. Made from flour, ale, or water. Sometimes eggs if you were lucky. Some even threw in saffron to give it a golden hue, though that was likely reserved for special occasions. Historians still argue whether saffron was more widely used among London's working classes than we think, or if the records simply reflect aspirational cookery. Either way, that yellow fritter probably meant something was being celebrated, or that the vendor was seriously showing off. You lean against a post as you munch, watching the queue grow. The fry stall is busiest at dusk, workers finishing their shifts, kids with a penny to spend, even friars shuffling in quietly, their hoods pulled low, pretending it's not their third fritter of the evening. There's a sort of communal joy to it, crunching together, crumbs falling, grease staining fingers. No one cares. It's hot, and it's good. Here's a charming little tidbit. The sound of fritters frying was sometimes used in plays and stories as shorthand for merriment and chaos. One chronicler wrote of a tavern so rowdy that the fritter pan leapt like a devil possessed. Another tale describes a man falling into a fryer during a drunken argument, only to get pulled out and immediately offered another fritter as consolation. You can't make this stuff up. Not all fritters were sold from stalls. Wealthy homes had their own versions, refined, spiced, perhaps fried in almond oil rather than animal fat. One manuscript details a fritter made with rose petals and sugar. Another suggests stuffing them with dates and ginger, but on the street, utility reigned. If it could be battered, it was fair game. The woman behind the stall eyes your empty hands and grins, already flipping another one your way. You take it. This one filled with onion, the batter lighter, almost fluffy. You thank her. She winks. Tomorrow it's sheep's brain, she says, then laughs. You sincerely hope she's joking. You wander off into the alley, full but curious. Did everyone know what they were eating? Probably not. But the mystery was half the fun, like a medieval version of mystery meat at summer camp, just with better seasoning and a decent chance of lard poisoning. By now, the light is fading, and the smell of cooling oil turns slightly rancid. But you're not put off. You're part of it now. The rhythm of evening food, the haze of smoke, the comfort of grease and crunch. One last bite, one last crispy edge. Your fingers glisten in the torchlight. And the best part? It's cheap. A fritter could cost a single farthing. That meant even a poor laborer could end their day with something warm in their belly. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't clean, but it was shared. Across class, age, gender, it didn't matter. In the world of medieval snacks, the humble fritter was king. The night has settled in, but medieval London doesn't sleep just yet. Not when there's still food to sell. The streets are quieter now, less chaotic. But from shadowy doorways and dim alleyways, the sounds of sizzling pans and murmured bartering still carry on. You follow the trail, weaving through the damp cobblestones until you come upon a different sort of vendor. A man with a wooden tray slung over his shoulders, hung with small baked goods, pies, specifically small, hand-sized, and suspiciously uniform. Yes, tonight is about the infamous meat pie. You're in the era of the mystery filling, and whether you call it a pie, a pasty, or a coffin. Yes, really, that was the term for a thick crust that's sealed in meat like a sarcophagus. You're about to experience the height of convenient, portable dining. Just don't ask too many questions. The vendor beckons you closer with a warm smile and a flaky pie held out like a peace offering. Still warm, he says. Chicken, probably. You blink, he shrugs. Could be goose, could be something else. Still good. You take it anyway, because of course you do. Here's your straight-up historical fact. Pies were everywhere. They were a medieval staple, not only because they tasted good, but because they were practical. The crust, especially for the lower classes, wasn't always meant to be eaten. It was a baking shell, a preservative, and a lunchbox in one. People would crack them open, scoop out the contents, and toss the dough if it was too hard or stale. Wealthier folk had fancier pies, made with butter-rich short crusts and decorated with elaborate designs. But the average Londoner just wanted something hot and filling. Now, the fillings. Well, that's where things get a little murky. Sure, you had your honest chicken pies, eel pies, very common, rabbit and leek pies. But there were also cheaper options: offal pies, blood pies, and the dreaded mixed meat pie, which could contain anything from leftover pork trimmings to, well, let's just say urban wildlife. Cats, dogs, and even rooks were rumored to have made it into pies during lean times. Historians still argue whether these tales were urban legends meant to discredit rivals or genuine culinary practices born from desperation. You take a bite. It's peppery. The meat is finely chopped, well seasoned with sage and maybe nutmeg, and the crust is flaky but dense, not bad at all. Maybe it is chicken or rat. You'll never know. A fringe delight from the period, lamprey pie. These slippery eel-like fish were considered a delicacy, especially among nobles. They were often cooked in wine with spices, then encased in a rich crust and served at banquets. King Henry allegedly died after eating a surfeit of lampreys. And while modern historians suspect other causes, the reputation stuck, still. Some cooks tried to replicate the royal taste on a budget, swapping lamprey for something more affordable. The result? Mock lamprey pies made from beef, fish scraps, or whatever passed for eel in the Thames that week. Pie making became such a skill that entire guilds specialized in pastry. Bakers had strict rules about what they could sell and how it was made. There were even pie inspectors, not for taste, of course, but for honesty and hygiene. If a pie was found to contain unfit meat or false advertising, it could be confiscated and the vendor fined or shamed publicly. And there was theater in pie, too. You might recall the tale of pies being used to hide live birds. Yes, that rhyme about 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie likely has a basis in fact. At high-end feasts, cooks would construct enormous pastry shells, bake them empty, then fill them with live creatures, birds, frogs, even dwarves for entertainment. When cut open, the contents would burst forth, to the amusement or horror of the diners. But back on the street, there's no time for spectacle. This is practical pie, sustenance pie, a food so beloved that it became part of the city's identity. Eel pie alone was so popular that whole neighborhoods were known for it, and the tradition lasted well into the 20th century. You lick a bit of gravy off your thumb and keep walking. Another vendor has a tray of sweet pies, apple, pear, maybe quince if you're lucky. The smell of cinnamon and clove draws you closer. Spices were expensive, but not impossible to come by in London's markets, especially the cheaper, less pure versions imported via long trade routes. You try a bite of one filled with stewed apples and honey. It's sticky and warm, with a faintly bitter edge from the rough pastry. It's also oddly comforting, like medieval street dessert. And yes, fritters were more common, but sweet pies had their moment too, especially around holidays and fairs. One more bite. The crust crumbles between your fingers, warm filling sliding onto your palm. You glance around, No napkins, of course, just the sleeve of your tunic and a hopeful dog sniffing at your ankles. By now, your stomach is full, and your mouth is tingling with spices and salt and 100 years' worth of questionable fillings. But as you pass another vendor, lighting his torch and setting out a fresh row of glistening pies, you know you'll be back. Because in medieval London, if you couldn't trust your local pie man, who could you trust? The hour grows late, and the city starts to hush. But London never quite shuts down. Not when there's still coin to be made. You pass the sleeping shapes of tired laborers curled in alley corners and the flickering lamplight of taverns just starting to fill. The air is thicker now, heavy with smoke, spilled ale, and something faintly sour wafting from the Thames. And yet, there's one more corner to turn, because the city has one last gift for the nocturnal forager: offal. You're entering the nose-to-tail world of medieval resourcefulness, where no part of the animal is wasted and everything gets eaten. Eventually, you might hesitate. Nose crinkled as a thin lad sets up a tray over glowing coals, steam rising in small bursts. He's selling umbles. Yes, the origin of the phrase, to eat humble pie. It's a stew of bits and pieces: heart, liver, kidneys, intestines, sometimes brain, boiled down, seasoned just enough to make it palatable, and served in a small wooden bowl with a crust of day-old bread. You're handed a portion without asking. He assumes you want it. Everyone does. If they're still out this late, you take the bowl, and the warmth hits you first. Then the smell, meaty, earthy, with a strange sweetness beneath. You take a bite. It's soft, rich, almost creamy in places, though you quickly learn to avoid chewing for too long. Let's get our historical fact in early tonight. Offal was standard fare in medieval diets, especially in urban centers like London. While nobles preferred prime cuts, peasants and the working class got everything else. But that everything else was often fresher than you'd think. Slaughterhouses were located within or just outside the city walls, meaning offal could be sold and consumed almost immediately. No time for decay. Assuming you got there early. And get this, offal wasn't necessarily a sign of poverty. In fact, certain organs were considered delicacies. Tongue, for example, was often salted and sold at a higher price. Liver was prized for its richness. Even tripe had its fans, especially when cleaned thoroughly and cooked with herbs. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of offal in medieval cities was primarily a necessity of class or simply a reflection of culinary ingenuity. After all, waste not, want not. And then there's the fringe side of things. Some dishes made of offal were downright luxurious. A recipe from a 14th century manuscript describes a white pudding made with sweat, liver, oats, and spices, all encased in stomach lining. Another calls for lamb brains whipped with cream and egg yolk, likely served at feasts where diners had no idea what they were eating and were probably better off that way. You pass another stall. This one specializes in singed ears, pig's ears to be specific, grilled on metal rods until the edges curl and crisp. The vendor salts them and dips them in a sour vinegar, then hands them out wrapped in thick leaves. You try one. Because why not? It's chewy, crunchy, and tastes oddly like popcorn left on a fire for too long. Not bad, not good, just medieval. Offal stalls were especially common around butchers' alleys. In London, places like Eastcheap and Newgate were notorious for their smells, but they were also prime food spots. And if you knew the right vendors, you could get a steaming bowl of stewed kidney or a skewer of roasted heart for a single penny. The meat was often tough, but it was filling. Add some turnips or stale beer bread, and you had a meal that could keep you on your feet for another few hours of dock work or night watch. Speaking of bread, much of it was used like a sponge. Trencher bread, baked hard and flat, was used to scoop up the last bits of stew, and then either eaten or tossed to beggars or dogs. You use yours to soak up the broth. It's dense, sour, slightly burnt. You chew slowly. It does the job. And there's humor, too. A popular street rhyme from the time went something like, kidney for courage, liver for might, trip and stumble on tripe at night. A not-so-subtle jab at the slipperiness of offal vendors' stalls, where more than one customer wound up face first in a puddle of boiling broth. Yet, even here, there's comfort. The vendor claps you on the back as you finish. That'll keep the chill off your bones, he says. He's not wrong. The food is hearty. The kind that lingers in your gut like a warm coal. You wipe your hands on your tunic and thank him. There's something bonding about this. You and the dozen others hunched over bowls, all strangers, all tired, all chewing silently. No one says much. There's no need. You're all here for the same reason. Hunger, habit, maybe even a little nostalgia. And as you lean back against a soot-covered wall, bowl empty, you wonder what tomorrow night's offering will be. Tongue in jelly, blood sausage on toast, or perhaps that rumored roasted crow on a spit from the bridge vendors. The sky begins to lighten ever so slightly, a faint gray creeping behind the black. The city will stir again soon, but for now, in this quiet moment of broth and bread and still simmering pans, you are full, and you are strangely, inexplicably content. The sky is a bruised violet now, bleeding slowly into gray. Dawn is coming, but you're still trailing through the remnants of night. London is quieter, yes, but that doesn't mean it's cleaner. You wrinkle your nose as you pass another stack of refuse near the edge of the market, where the street slopes ever so slightly toward the Thames. You've stepped in something. Again. But the smell? That's not just decay. That's cheese? Yes, cheese. Street cheese. The unsung companion to all those meat pies, awful stews, and greasy fritters you've been sampling. While it's never the star of medieval London's junk food lineup, it's always there, on trenchers, in tarts, shaved over hot grains, or sold in crumbling chunks to be nibbled like snacks between tasks. You round a corner and find a wiry woman slicing rounds of soft, white cheese from a pale, sunken wheel. The edge is moldy, but the middle, lush, creamy, tangy. She wraps it in a scrap of cloth and passes it to you without ceremony. Here's your straightforward fact. Medieval Londoners ate a lot of cheese. It was one of the few animal products affordable across all classes. And unlike milk, which spoiled quickly, cheese could be stored and transported. Soft cheeses were more common among peasants. They were quicker to make and easier to sell fresh. Hard cheeses took longer, aged in cellars and sold at a premium to wealthier buyers, or exported to nearby towns. Records from the 13th century show that London imported huge quantities of cheese from surrounding counties like Somerset and Suffolk. You take a bite. It's creamy, a little sour, slightly gritty near the rind, not exactly brie, but it gets the job done. What's particularly fun and mildly disturbing is how cheese played into street food at the time. You stop by another stand where a baker is flipping pancakes on a blackened stone. He slides one off and sprinkles it with what he calls fried cheese crumbs. These are shavings from hardened, almost stale wheels of cheese, fried until they bubble and crisp. The result? A medieval proto-Dorito. It's salty, pungent, and has the texture of someone else's dental work. You love it anyway. Of course, there was also the weird stuff. Cheese used medicinally. Go figure. A fringe remedy from a 15th century recipe book suggests heating old goat cheese mixed with vinegar and honey and applying it to the forehead to treat melancholia. Another recommended rubbing cheese curds on boils, which, frankly, we won't try. Historians still argue whether these concoctions were ever truly used or just listed in compilations alongside magical charms and unlikely prayers. You linger near a tavern's side window where a sleepy-eyed cook is laying out chunks of curd in the early light. There's a jug of warm ale next to it, breakfast, apparently, cheese and beer, the Londoner's combo meal. Some even soak the cheese in ale to soften it before spreading it on rye toast. Others tossed cubes of hard cheese into hot porridge, watching it melt into weird, chewy pockets. But cheese wasn't just for snacking. It snuck into all kinds of fast foods. Fried cheese pies, layered with herbs and sometimes onion, were popular on market days. Pottage, those bubbling stews you've seen in every corner, often had cheese stirred in at the last moment to thicken and enrich the flavor. One anonymous manuscript even lists cheese bread fried in goose fat as a festival treat. You spot a man with a cart full of what looks like skewers. Upon closer inspection, they're roasted root vegetables, onion, parsnip, maybe even beet, each dabbed with a smear of garlicky cheese before being passed to you. It's melting slightly from the heat, forming a gooey glaze over the blackened edges. It's delicious. You devour it in 4 bites and immediately wish for another. Still, not all cheese was equal. There were class distinctions in dairy. Cow's milk cheese was more common and cheaper, while goat's milk and sheep's milk varieties were prized for their tang and complexity. The wealthy had access to imports from France, yes, even back then, with varieties that aged beautifully and smelled like philosophical arguments. Peasants got the crumbly stuff, fresh, sharp, and wrapped in cloth that may or may not have been washed this week. Let's not forget the debates. Historians still can't agree on just how widespread aged cheese was in the daily diet. Some argue that most cheese was eaten fresh or green, while others believe more preservation took place than previously thought, particularly among traveling merchants or sailors. After all, a wheel of aged cheese could last months if stored properly. Though properly, in medieval London, is always a bit of a gamble. You sit on a crooked step and nibble your last wedge while a chicken struts past like it owns the block. The scent of cheese, coal smoke, and something vaguely herbal fills the air. Maybe that's sage. Maybe that's mold. You don't care anymore. You're full again. Not just in your belly, but in your brain, loaded with the bizarre, humble glory of a food that never needed prestige to survive. Cheese just persisted. It clung to the edges of other dishes. It floated in beer soup. It coated leeks. It showed up at weddings and funerals and everything in between. And for a moment, beneath the yawning sky and the clatter of the waking carts, you understand the quiet power of this simple thing. In a city of dirt and plague and hustle, something as small as a hunk of soft cheese could be a little luxury, a kindness, a glue that held the meal, and maybe the people together. You lick the last bit from your fingers, brush crumbs from your tunic, and rise. There's more ahead, always is. But for now, you carry with you the taste of old milk, salt, and patience, medieval London's most unlikely comfort food. You're walking now beneath a sky that can't decide if it wants to be dawn or just more of the same damp gray. A fine drizzle starts, lazy and half-hearted, but persistent. You pull your cloak tighter, if you have one, and squint ahead at the narrow lane where smoke curls from chimneys and steam hisses up from cooking pots set directly on the stones. You're approaching what might be the coziest corner of medieval London street food culture. Hot grain-based meals. This isn't flashy food. It doesn't glisten like a meat pie or sizzle like a skewer of eel. No. This is the slow, thick, bubbling heart of the city's diet. Gruels, porridges, and pottages, thick with whatever the vendor could find. And right now, that smell wafting through the misty air, that's oats. Probably with a bit of onion, maybe a spoonful of bone broth stirred in. It's not beautiful, but it will stick to your ribs for hours. Here's your core historical fact. Grain was the bedrock of the medieval diet. And not just in bread, in London especially, porridge-style dishes were sold in near every market. Oats, barley, wheat. If it could be boiled into submission, it ended up in a pot. These meals were cheap, simple, and nourishing, perfect for laborers and families who couldn't afford meat more than once a week. A thick spoonful of pottage might be all a person ate from morning to dusk. And let's clear something up. Pottage wasn't a single dish. It was more of a concept. You look over the shoulder of a girl, ladling it into wooden bowls, and you see that today's version is pale gray, dotted with carrot rounds and what might be turnip. Tomorrow it could be green, from leeks or wild herbs. Sometimes it was watery and sad. Sometimes, if you were lucky, thick enough to stand a spoon in. You get your scoop. It's warm. It's vaguely peppery. There are whole peas in here, a bit of shredded cabbage, maybe even a tiny sliver of ham. Luxury. The best pottage makers are the ones who figured out how to layer flavor without wasting anything. A dash of vinegar, a pinch of stale beer, a charred onion stirred in at the end. You catch hints of sage, thyme, maybe even nutmeg, if the cook's been raiding the spice markets. And the grains, chewy, soft, creamy, depending on how long they've been bubbling, are the backbone. This isn't fast food like we think of it, but it's fast enough, and it's everywhere. Now here's the quirky bit. Some pottages were sweet. Yes, sweet. Vendors occasionally sold porridge made with dried fruits, milk if it was available, and even honey for those with a spare coin. This was popular among children and, more amusingly, among older monks, who found sweet grains easier on the teeth. Some of these dishes are the ancestors of your modern-day oatmeal, though without the microwave and with far more chewing. The city's grain supply was a serious matter. London was fed by dozens of surrounding mills and grain farms, and bakeries had strict regulations about how much flour could be used and how it had to be priced. Historians still argue whether grain shortages during certain periods were due to poor harvests or the result of corrupt middlemen hoarding supplies. Either way, When grain was scarce, people went hungry. And when it was plentiful, vendors got creative. You round a corner and spot a man selling what he calls mash. It's a thick barley stew, mashed down and spiced, then cut into squares and fried on a hot iron plate. The outside crisps, the inside steams. You burn your tongue and don't regret it. Near the river, another pot is bubbling. This one has dried beans, crumbled rye bread, and a swirl of goose fat glistening across the surface. The vendor doesn't say anything, just hands you a bowl with a tired nod. You eat standing, the warm steam fogging your face, your boots splashed with mud and water. You hear someone mutter something about frumenti. That's the fancy kind of grain dish. Cracked wheat boiled in almond milk or meat stock, sometimes flavored with saffron and sweetened with dried fruits, usually reserved for holidays or church feasts. But some enterprising vendors would sell it by the bowlful in a springtime, when people needed cheering up after a long winter of root vegetables and watery beer. Not all grain meals were slop in a pot, though. Some were baked into thick cakes, dense, chewy, made from barley and honey and fennel seeds. They kept for days, though you needed strong teeth to get through them. Others were spread thin and fried like pancakes, then smeared with soft cheese or sprinkled with salt. In summer, these cakes were sometimes served cold, sliced and sold with pickled vegetables as a midday snack. One of your favorite bites comes from an old woman who sells a dish she calls stone pot grain. It's made by boiling cracked grain with marrow bones for hours, until it takes on a gelatinous shine. She throws in a spoonful of mashed garlic and tops it with green onions and a twist of pickled radish. It tastes like comfort and sharpness and depth all at once. Of course, not everyone appreciated grain dishes. Contemporary writings sometimes mocked pottage as poor man's paste. A joke in a 14th century poem compares it to eating sops in the devil's bathwater. But really, it was just about expectations. When you're hungry, even gray mush can feel like a feast. And there's this, for the poorest Londoners, even pottage required planning, the right vendor, a spare penny, a clean bowl. Sometimes people brought their own pots and had them filled straight from the cauldron, then took them home to feed a family of 6. There are accounts of neighbors pooling coins to buy a single bowl and share it. Thin broth passed from one cracked spoon to the next. The drizzle thickens now, becoming a steady whisper against rooftops and your shoulders. The cook covers her pot with a lid. Her fire hisses. She packs up, and so do you. But you carry the memory of that hot, steaming bowl, simple, earthy, sustaining. And you realize something. Grain isn't exciting. It doesn't sparkle. But it's always there, dependable, warm, a soft place to land after a night wandering cobbled streets. Maybe that's why it never left the menu. Not then. Not now. The rain has stopped. The streets glisten with a fresh sheen, reflecting the flicker of torchlight and the glow from the tavern windows as you wander deeper into the heart of medieval London's daily bustle. The air is thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke, damp stone, and something else, a sharp, sour tang that you recognize instantly, vinegar. You've stumbled upon the pungent world of medieval pickles and preserved foods, London's answer to making fresh ingredients last just a little longer. Pickling, fermenting, and curing weren't just culinary choices back then, they were survival tactics. Fresh vegetables and fruits lasted only days before turning soft or rotting in the damp London air. So people preserved what they could: cabbages, onions, cucumbers, apples. Even fish and meats were salted or smoked to stretch their lifespan. This wasn't gourmet. It was practicality coated with a bit of sharp, sour bite. Your first fact: Londoners loved pickles. And we don't just mean the cucumber variety you know. Pickled walnuts, pickled garlic, and fermented turnips were all common snacks or meal add-ons. You see a vendor selling wooden barrels filled with brine, the tops covered with leafy greens to keep the contents submerged. She offers you a small, briny chunk of something she calls sow's cabbage. It tastes sharp and salty, with a faint hint of sourness that wakes up your tongue like a slap from a damp glove. What's quirky here is how pickling also became a way to recycle leftovers. Some recipes called for stale beer or wine to be mixed with vinegar to create a pickle bath for turning tired vegetables or even meat scraps into something resembling a new dish. It wasn't just about taste, it was about economics and waste reduction, long before those words existed. Here's an interesting scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the sour, fermented foods were a daily staple for most Londoners, or just seasonal luxuries, eaten when fresh produce was scarce. Some evidence suggests pickles were mainly consumed in winter, while others think brined vegetables added a year-round tanginess to meals. You follow the scent down a narrow alley where a group of workers is munching on chunks of pickled onions and salted fish. They dip their bread into a communal pot of sharp mustard, adding heat and a bit of bite to the otherwise soft flavors. It's a meal of extremes: soft bread, crunchy onions, chewy fish, and fiery mustard. You reach for a piece of bread, smeared with mustard and topped with a slice of pickled herring. The salt and sourness hit your tongue in a satisfying explosion. Not everyone loved pickles, though. Some medieval cooks warned against overindulgence, claiming too much sour food upset the body's delicate humors. A theory you'll hear plenty about if you stay long enough. Yet pickled foods were prized in taverns as hangover cures and remedies for upset stomachs, making them both a culinary staple and a folk medicine. In the marketplace, you spot an unusual sight: a small booth where a man is selling something called mustard seed cakes. These dense cakes are packed with crushed mustard seeds and bits of pickled vegetables, baked hard and meant to be gnawed slowly. It's a curious snack, providing a spicy kick that would have jolted even the sleepiest Londoner awake. Preservation extended beyond vegetables. Fishmongers brined salted herring and cod, often stacking barrels in dim cellars near the docks. Meat was smoked or salted, turning it into a chewy, intense treat that lasted through the long, harsh winters. Even eggs could be pickled in ash and lime, transforming their texture and taste. You notice the popularity of vinegar, called sour wine in some circles, being used not just for pickling, but also as a condiment to brighten flavors or as a base for sauces. Vinegar was made from cider or wine that had gone bad, recycled again and again. Yet its sharpness was prized in the busy kitchens of taverns and inns. But what really surprises you is the social angle of pickled foods. The wealthier classes preferred fresh and elaborate dishes. But pickling was popular among all classes because it was cheap and practical. Markets buzzed with pickled goods, and street vendors sold small bites to passers-by, who would eat them on the go like medieval snack bars. As night falls fully now, you spot a group of children sharing a large wooden bowl filled with what looks like fermented cabbage, probably an early form of sauerkraut. Their faces are puckered, but they laugh through the sourness, passing the bowl around like it's a secret treasure. In the end, you realize that pickles were more than just food. They were part of the rhythm of survival in a city that didn't have fridges or freezers, just smoke, salt, and a stubborn will to keep eating no matter what. The dampness of the streets fades into the background as you step into the bright, clattering heart of a medieval London bakery. Flour dust floats in the air, settling on rough wooden tables and the backs of bustling bakers. You can almost taste the warm, yeasty scent of fresh bread, an aroma that probably felt like magic to medieval Londoners after a long day trudging through muddy alleys. Bread was the staple of life here, and the smell alone tells you why. It was everywhere, in every form, from dense rye loaves to crumbly barley breads, to the soft, white, yet fleetingly rare manchette loaf favored by the wealthy. For most Londoners, bread was the centerpiece of every meal, the base on which they built their modest diet. You grab a crusty slice from a vendor and bite in. It's chewy, a little sour from the natural leaven, and comforting in its simplicity. Your fact, medieval bread wasn't just food, it was currency and status. The finer the flour, the higher your social standing. The poor ate heavy, dark loaves made from barley or rye, while the rich enjoyed pale white bread that cost a fortune to make. Bakers were tightly regulated by the city's guilds, and there were strict rules about weight and price to prevent fraud. There's even a medieval phrase, to eat one's bread, meaning to earn a living honestly. But here's something quirky. Bread was sometimes baked with strange ingredients to add flavor or stretch the dough. People mixed in chestnut flour, peas, or even ground acorns. There were also savory breads, baked with bits of herbs, cheese, or bits of meat. And in some cases, especially during fast days when meat was forbidden, bread was a substitute for more elaborate meals. Historians still argue whether bread quality deteriorated drastically in times of scarcity, or whether clever bakers could maintain standards even during shortages. Some documents suggest bakers mixed in ground bones or chalk to bulk out the dough. But it's unclear how common this really was, or how willing customers were to tolerate it. In the busy market, you notice a curious sight: a vendor selling thieves' bread. This wasn't a specialty loaf for criminals, but bread infused with strong herbs like rosemary, sage, and garlic, believed to protect the eater from disease, particularly the plague. It's a strange blend of food and folk medicine, where eating was also about warding off invisible threats. Another popular treat is the humble flapjack, not the oat bar, you know, but a sweet, sticky cake made from oats, honey, and butter, cooked on griddles. Street children love these as quick energy, and you can imagine them sticky-fingered and giggling in dark alleyways. The recipes varied widely by season and availability of ingredients, reflecting the patchwork nature of medieval urban life. You overhear a conversation about trencher bread. This was thick, stale bread used as plates. Once the food on top was eaten, the trencher itself might be fed to dogs or soaked in broth for a second meal. Imagine eating your plate, then eating what your plate soaked up. Talk about zero waste. The Bakery Guild also controlled who could bake and where. And baking was physically demanding work. Bakers often had to rise before dawn, haul heavy sacks of flour, and manage blazing ovens with temperatures nobody today could measure accurately. The smell of burned bread was common, and there was a constant risk of fire in the crowded wooden neighborhoods. You noticed children running around with bits of broken bread, crumb bread, given as scraps by vendors or purchased cheaply. This bread was often dipped in broth or cheese to make a quick snack. Sometimes, this was all a poor child had to eat that day. Bakers also played a social role. Guild halls weren't just places for kneading dough. They were centers for networking, charity, and sometimes political discussion. Bread could be given as alms to the poor during religious festivals, reinforcing community bonds. As evening deepens, you catch a whiff of something different. A sweet bread baked with dried fruits and spiced with cinnamon. A rarity in London, but a sign of rising trade and the city's increasing taste for exotic flavors. These breads were often reserved for special occasions, maybe a wedding or a feast day. Bread, you realize, was more than just sustenance. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life, social order, and even superstition. The crust you just bit into was the product of laws, trades, fears, and hopes, all baked into a humble loaf. The rhythm of the day slows as you step away from the bakery's warmth and find yourself near a crowded market stall where a different kind of scent fills the air. Roasted meat sizzling over open flames. The rich, smoky aroma draws you in, promising flavors that the medieval Londoner prized, but only some could afford regularly. Roasting was a favored cooking method, and spit roasting over a fire was common at feasts and taverns. But this wasn't just for the lords. Street vendors also offered small cuts of meat roasted on skewers or in small spits, making it a quick, hearty snack for the working class. The crackling sound of fat dripping onto hot coals adds a mouth-watering soundtrack to the scene. Your fact? Londoners loved their meat, but it was expensive. The rich feasted on beef, pork, and game like venison and wild boar, while the poor mostly ate cheaper cuts or offal, organs like liver, heart, and kidneys, and sometimes only on special occasions. Meat was often salted or smoked to preserve it, and fresh meat was a rare luxury for many. A quirky tidbit: some medieval recipes called for bizarre combinations like cooking pork with fruit syrups, or even using rosewater in sauces. One delicacy involved stuffing a pig's stomach with a mix of herbs, grains, and offal, then boiling it to create a hearty pudding. You'd never guess the sweet and savory mingled so freely in medieval kitchens. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of offal was a matter of necessity or a deliberate taste preference. Some suggest it was mostly the poor making do, while others point to gourmet recipes in noble households that celebrated these parts as delicacies. As you watch, a vendor hands over a freshly roasted, skewered piece of mutton to a customer, wrapped hastily in parchment. This quick street food was perfect for those too busy to sit down at a tavern or afford a full meal. You bite into a similar skewer. The meat is smoky, tender, and salty. The fat crisped just right. Meat also had a spiritual angle. Certain days, especially fast days dictated by the church, forbade eating meat altogether. So, the market adapted by selling fish, eggs, and meat substitutes made from beans or cheese. But on non-fasting days, a good roast was a cause for celebration. At a nearby tavern, you overhear a group discussing a recipe for a black pudding, a blood sausage made from pig's blood, fat, and oats. This was a common filling dish, especially for the working class. Its dark color and strong flavor were beloved by some and avoided by others, much like today's divisive black pudding. Roasting wasn't the only way to prepare meat. Stews and pies were popular too. You spot a pie vendor selling thick, pastry-covered parcels filled with chunks of meat, vegetables, and spices. These pies were portable meals for travelers and laborers, often eaten cold or warmed by a fire. Interestingly, dogs often scavenged the streets, snatching scraps of meat fallen from market stalls or dropped by busy customers. Dogs in medieval London were more than pets. They were sometimes protectors, sometimes scavengers, but always part of the food ecosystem. You note that the smell of roasting meat mingles oddly with less appetizing scents. Waste from animals and fish often lingered in the alleys. This stark contrast reminds you that medieval London was a place of extremes, pleasure and hardship side by side. The grilling fire glows low as twilight falls. You imagine the workers, soldiers, and merchants returning home, carrying their warm pies and roasted meats to their humble tables. For them, this food was comfort and celebration wrapped into one. Though the rich had elaborate banquets with exotic spices and rare game, the simple pleasures of roasted meat on a spit, whether in a tavern or from a street vendor's stall, held their own charm, grounding the city in the reality of hunger and hearty appetite. You follow the smoky trails left by roasting fires into the back streets, where London's lesser-known snack culture unfolds, the sweet and sometimes sticky world of medieval sweets and confections. Unlike the savory, salty, or sour flavors that dominate daily life, these treats provide brief, sugary escapes, though not quite like the candies you know today. Sugar was rare and expensive, imported from far-off lands, and often reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. Instead, honey was the medieval sweetener of choice, drizzled over cakes, mixed into drinks, or crystallized into hard candies. You spot a vendor selling comfits, small sugar-coated seeds and nuts, glittering in the torchlight like edible jewels. Your historical fact: honey was the backbone of sweetening in medieval London, often fermented into mead, a popular alcoholic beverage. Beeswax candles scented the air in homes and churches, linking sweetness and light in the city's rituals and daily life. Here's a quirky detail. Some sweets involved strange ingredients, like rose petals candied in honey or sugar, which were not just tasty, but also believed to have medicinal properties. People often munched on sweetened spices like ginger or cinnamon, thinking they helped with digestion and circulation. Historians still argue how common these sweets were among common folk, while records show nobles indulged in elaborate sugar sculptures and spiced confections. It's debated whether the average Londoner tasted much beyond honeyed cakes or a bit of candied fruit. You watch as children cluster around a stall selling marchpane, an almond paste treat shaped into small fruits and animals, colored with natural dyes from plants. This was a delicacy often given during festivals or religious holidays. The children's eyes light up, but they can only afford a tiny piece. Street vendors also sell gingerbread, not the spicy cookie we know, but dense. honey-sweetened cakes often shaped with simple molds. This treat was especially popular at fairs and markets, a quick pick-me-up for tired shoppers or weary travelers. An intriguing custom you overhear involves sugar plums, a catch-all term for small, hard candies made from compressed sugar, seeds, or dried fruits. These were sometimes given to children as rewards, or to adults as palate cleansers after heavy meals. The presence of these sweets hints at London's place in global trade networks. Exotic spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, imported from the East, flavored both savory and sweet dishes, weaving the city into a web of commerce and culture. Yet, for many, these spices were rare luxuries, making the ordinary honey cake more of a treat than a staple. You spot a group of nuns handing out honey cakes to poor children outside a church, a gesture of charity and kindness amid the harshness of urban life. Food, after all, was often intertwined with religion, charity, and social standing. As night deepens, the scent of caramelizing sugar mingles oddly with the damp air and distant sounds of closing shops. You imagine the fleeting pleasure these sweets offered, brief moments of joy in a world dominated by hard labor and simple tastes. Yet, you realize this sweetness carried more than flavor. It carried hope, celebration, and the promise of respite from the sour, salty, and smoky flavors that ruled the rest of the day. The fading glow of lanterns guides you towards the waterways of medieval London, where the city's relationship with fish and seafood reveals itself in surprising ways. The Thames is alive with the clatter of boats and the cries of fishermen selling their fresh catch at docksides, filling the air with a sharp, briny tang. Fish was a crucial part of London diets, especially on religious fast days when meat was forbidden. Cod, herring, and eels were staples, often dried or salted to preserve them for long journeys inland. Fishmongers' stalls line the streets, and you catch sight of a vendor expertly filleting a large salmon, deftly slicing away the scales with practiced hands. Here's a historical fact. The church's influence meant that many Londoners ate fish regularly, with fast days making up nearly half the year's calendar. This religious diet shaped the city's markets and cooking habits profoundly. A quirky tidbit you notice. Londoners had a peculiar fondness for pickled herrings soaked in vinegar and spices, which were sometimes eaten with bread or cheese as a quick snack. This strong-flavored dish was often paired with ale to wash down the pungency. Historians still argue whether the average Londoner's fish consumption was truly sufficient to offset the scarcity of meat, or whether poor preservation often led to spoiled fish, causing illness. Some accounts suggest that fish was more a seasonal luxury than a reliable protein source year-round. Nearby, a fishmonger sells jellied eels, a distinctly London delicacy even in medieval times. These eels were boiled, chopped, and allowed to set into a savory jelly, a dish that would later become emblematic of the city's East End. The texture and flavor are surprising but beloved by locals. Fish pies are also popular street fare. These dense, savory pies contain chunks of salted or fresh fish mixed with herbs, onions, and sometimes almonds or raisins. A sweet, salty twist you wouldn't expect, but was common in medieval cooking. At the docks, the sounds of seagulls and the occasional splash remind you how close the city was to natural waterways that provided both livelihood and nourishment. Fishmongers were organized into guilds that regulated quality and pricing, much like bakers and butchers, to prevent cheating and maintain standards. The smell is a mix of salt, seaweed, and something slightly sour. The natural odor of fish markets, but also a reminder of the less sanitary conditions that sometimes prevailed. Fish waste often ended up in the streets, attracting rats and adding to the city's pungent aromas. Interestingly, oysters were prized, but not always expensive. Londoners from various classes enjoyed them raw or cooked, often shucked on street corners and eaten quickly by hungry crowds. The banks of the Thames teemed with oysters, making them a common urban snack. You overhear a debate about whether salted or fresh fish was more popular, with some claiming fresh fish was a rare luxury beyond the reach of many. Preservation methods were primitive, and a day too long in the market could mean spoilage. As darkness settles, the fishmongers pack up their stalls, the day's catch dwindling down to remnants destined for the poor or for dogs. The Thames reflects the flicker of torchlight, a silent witness to centuries of culinary and cultural exchange. This scene of fish and seafood markets reminds you that London's food was a patchwork of nature, religion, trade, and survival. Each bite a story from the river to the table. You wander away from the busy fish stalls and find yourself drawn into the realm of medieval beverages, those mysterious brews and potions that fueled the city's daily grind and festive nights alike. Ale, wine, mead, and even something more obscure fill the cups of Londoners across social classes. Ale is the undisputed staple here, its yeasty, slightly sour aroma filling taverns and streets alike. It's the common man's drink, brewed locally with barley and flavored, sometimes with herbs or spices. You can almost taste the thick, foamy brew as you pass a tavern where patrons clink wooden mugs and sing bawdy songs. Your historical fact: medieval Londoners consumed more ale per capita than water, mainly because water sources were often contaminated. Ale was considered safer, thanks to the boiling during brewing, making it a liquid lifeline. A quirky tidbit: small beer was a weaker version of ale, often consumed by children and laborers because it was less intoxicating but still safer than water. You might find yourself sipping something with only 1–2% alcohol by today's standards, more like a fizzy health tonic than a party starter. Historians still argue whether alehouses were mainly social hubs or if they had a darker reputation as places of vice and disorder. Some records show strict regulations on serving times and conduct, while others celebrate alehouses as centers of community life. Mead. The honey-fermented drink you smelled near the sweet stalls earlier was rarer and often reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. It had a smooth, floral sweetness that made it a favorite for feasts and religious ceremonies, blending the worlds of drink and ritual. Wine, meanwhile, was mostly imported from France, Spain, or the Mediterranean, and it carried a prestige that ale lacked. The wealthy sipped red or white wine, often diluted with water and spiced with cinnamon, cloves, or even rosewater. You overhear a merchant boasting about a recent shipment of claret, a luxury red wine. At a bustling market stall, You notice a vendor selling possets, warm drinks made from hot milk, curdled with ale or wine, and flavored with spices like nutmeg or cinnamon. These were considered comforting remedies for cold nights and minor ailments, blending taste with folk medicine. There's also cider made from apples, especially popular in rural areas and sometimes brought into the city. Its tart, refreshing flavor offered a fruity alternative to the malt-heavy ales. You watch as a group of young apprentices gather at a corner tavern, drinking small beer and sharing jokes. Their laughter is a reminder that even in tough times, these brews connected people, workmates bonding over a shared mug after long days. The smell of hops and malt blends oddly with the city's usual aromas, creating a complex scentscape unique to medieval London. Ale brewing was big business, with entire neighborhoods devoted to brewing and selling their product. Interestingly, herbal ales with added herbs like wormwood or juniper were believed to aid digestion and health, mixing taste with early ideas of medicinal food. You reflect on the drink's role beyond thirst quenching. Ale and its cousins structured daily life, influenced work patterns, social habits, and even religious observance. The medieval cup was never just about flavor. It was a cultural symbol. As night deepens, the ale houses glow warmly, drawing in those seeking comfort and camaraderie. You imagine the city winding down with the clinking of mugs, a bittersweet soundtrack to London's medieval nights. The city's rhythm now softens, guiding you toward a quieter yet essential aspect of medieval food life: how Londoners sourced and stored their food to survive the unpredictable seasons. This backstage glimpse reveals the clever, sometimes odd methods they relied on to keep ingredients fresh, or at least edible. You step into a dimly lit cellar beneath a timber-framed house where barrels, sacks, and earthenware pots line the walls. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots sit in boxes filled with sand to keep them from freezing in winter. Meanwhile, salted meats hang overhead, curing slowly in the cool air. Here's your historical fact. Before refrigeration, medieval Londoners relied heavily on salting, smoking, and pickling to preserve food. Salt was a precious commodity, imported mainly from coastal regions, and its availability influenced what food people could keep through harsh winters. A quirky tidbit: some households used garlands of herbs, flowers, or onions hung from rafters, not just for scent, but to deter pests and even mask the smell of curing meat. Imagine walking into a medieval kitchen where rosemary and lavender mingle with drying bacon and fermenting cabbage. Historians still argue whether medieval preservation methods were efficient enough to prevent frequent food shortages, or if spoilage and waste were rampant. Some records suggest households managed surprisingly well, while others hint at recurrent hunger crises due to poor storage. In the marketplace, vendors sell barrels of salted fish and pickled vegetables, the salty tang of brine strong in the air. These preserved goods were often the difference between meals in lean months and feasts in good seasons. You notice that large households, especially in the nobility, had dedicated larders and cool storage rooms, sometimes built underground or against north-facing walls to stay cooler. Meanwhile, poorer homes might stash food in root cellars or simply under straw piles. Drying was another popular preservation technique. Herbs, fruits, and even small fish were hung to dry in attics or special racks. The texture and flavor changed, sometimes enhancing dishes by concentrating tastes or providing chewy, sweet morsels when fresh options were scarce. Salted pork was a staple in many diets, often boiled in stews to rehydrate the tough, salty meat. You overhear a vendor discussing the latest shipment of salt from the coasts of Essex, vital to the city's food economy. Interestingly, some Londoners kept live animals like chickens or rabbits inside their yards or even homes to ensure a fresh supply of eggs and meat. This close relationship with animals was both practical and, for some, a source of comfort. The smell in a typical medieval storage room was a mix of earthiness, brine, and faint fermentation. Less appetizing than a bakery, but vital for survival. You imagine the quiet effort behind every meal, not just cooking, but preserving, planning, and rationing. You reflect on how these practices created a cycle of anticipation and relief, waiting for the next harvest, the next shipment of salt, the next preserved batch to come through winter. Food was not just nourishment, but a measured gamble against nature's whims. As the city cools for night, the quiet clink of wooden barrels and rustle of dried herbs echo in your mind, a reminder that every feast, every humble meal, was backed by hard-earned knowledge and patient labor. As the evening deepens, your path leads you into the bustling heart of medieval London's street food scene, where the city's fastest, most practical meals come alive, ready-to-eat snacks and quick bites served to the hungry crowd on the go. These morsels reflect the urgency and variety of life in a city that never quite sleeps. You find yourself at a busy street corner where vendors call out their wares, fresh meat pies, hot and hearty. Fry up anyone, crisp and golden? The air is thick with smells of frying fat, spiced meats, and warm bread, mixing into an irresistible urban perfume. A key historical fact: meat pies were among the earliest and most common portable foods, dating back to Roman times, but perfected by medieval cooks. These pies were practical, encased in thick pastry coffins that preserved the filling and kept hands clean, perfect for those without tables. You notice the peculiar fact that some pies contained unexpected ingredients like offal, raisins, or even fish, spiced to mask their more humble origins. These hearty snacks fed laborers, merchants, and travelers alike, providing fuel for long workdays and late-night conversations. Historians still argue whether street food vendors were strictly regulated or operated in a gray area of legality. Some sources describe guilds controlling quality and prices, while others paint a picture of bustling, informal stalls filling gaps in the market. Nearby, a vendor fries dripping cakes made from leftover fat and flour, shaped into small cakes and fried to a crispy golden brown. These treats were inexpensive, filling, and beloved by children and adults who needed a quick energy boost. You catch sight of spiced buns, sweet bread rolls perfumed with cinnamon, cloves, and dried fruits, often sold during festivals or cold weather months. These were a rare sweet indulgence, carrying spices that hinted at faraway lands. The noise around you swells with customers jostling for position, children begging for scraps, and the constant clatter of pots and pans. This noisy scene contrasts with the quiet dignity of the noble feasts you've glimpsed earlier, but shares the same essential purpose: to feed a city. You overhear a vendor advertising pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and sometimes bits of meat or fish ladled into wooden bowls and eaten on the spot. It's a humble but nutritious option, especially during colder months. The smells here are intense and varied: hot grease, sweet spices, sour ale, and smoky wood fires. This olfactory patchwork is part of what gives medieval London its character, a sensory tapestry woven through every alley and square. Interestingly, some vendors specialized in sops, slices of bread soaked in broth or wine, an easy filling snack that was quick to prepare and even quicker to consume. Perfect for workers who couldn't afford to sit down for a full meal. You note how these street foods not only provided nourishment, but social connection. Spaces where people exchanged news, jokes, and gossip. The market stalls were hubs of urban life, pulsing with energy and human stories. As the night wears on, the crowd thins and vendors begin packing up, their tired voices and empty baskets signaling the end of another day's grind. You sense the city's heartbeat slowing, but know that tomorrow the streets will come alive again, with the same smoky, spicy symphony. You feel the city's pulse slowing now, guiding you gently toward the final piece of this nocturnal journey: the enduring legacy of medieval London's junk food culture and how it shaped the city's evolving identity over centuries. The echoes of those bustling markets, smoky taverns, and preserved pantries linger in surprising ways, even in today's London. Medieval junk food wasn't just about quick calories. It was a survival toolkit crafted from necessity, resourcefulness, and a complex web of social, religious, and economic factors. The city's palate was defined by what was available, affordable, and allowed by the strict dictates of church and class. Here's a historical fact to ground this final thought. By the late Middle Ages, London had developed a sophisticated network of guilds and regulations, controlling the quality and sale of food, laying early foundations for modern food safety laws. These institutions, imperfect as they were, helped shape a reliable, if humble, urban diet, a quirky tidbit you might enjoy. Some Londoners' favorite snacks, like jellied eels or spiced buns, have survived in various forms into modern times, connecting you directly to tastes first enjoyed centuries ago, albeit in somewhat updated fashions. So, when you order that quirky eel dish or a cinnamon bun, you're biting into history itself. Historians still argue whether the medieval city's food culture should be viewed mainly as a story of hardship or of resilience and innovation. Was it a grim struggle with disease and scarcity, or a rich tapestry of culinary creativity born from constraint? Probably both, woven tightly together. You imagine the smoky glow of candlelit taverns echoing through time, the shouts of street vendors fading into the hum of modern markets, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the rush of city air. These sensory threads tie the past and present in an unbroken chain. London's medieval junk food was also a mirror, reflecting its social fabric, the gap between rich and poor, the intertwining of religious observance with daily life, and the ever-present tension between nature's bounty and the city's growing appetite. Perhaps the greatest legacy is how these humble foods connect us to ordinary people long gone: the laborers, the fishmongers, the bakers, the alehouse regulars, whose daily routines shaped the city's heartbeat. Their meals were quick, often rough, but deeply human. As you prepare to leave this world of smoky fires, salt-cured meats, and bustling stalls, you carry with you a renewed appreciation for the flavors of survival and the stories hidden in every bite. London's medieval junk food may have been rough around the edges, but it was rich with life and meaning. So as you settle deeper into comfort, maybe even reach for a modern snack, remember this: every city's soul lives in its food. And tonight, you've tasted a piece of London's long, winding history, one crumb at a time. Now, as the night deepens and your eyelids grow heavy, let your mind drift softly away from the bustling markets, smoky taverns, and cobbled streets of medieval London. Imagine the gentle crackle of fires dying down, the last murmurs of voices fading into the calm hush of night. The aromas of salt and spice, of fresh bread and smoky meat, slowly dissolve into the cool night air, leaving only a quiet stillness. You are wrapped in the warmth of history, a cozy blanket woven from centuries of human stories, of survival, of creativity, and the simple need to eat, to gather, and to live. These ancient flavors, once so vital and urgent, now soften into gentle memories, like a lullaby sung by the city itself. Breathe deeply, and let the sounds of time's passing carry you gently toward rest. The world outside may bustle and rush, but here, in this quiet moment, you find peace in the knowledge that we are all connected through the ages by the meals we share and the stories we tell. Let the city's past fade slowly as your own dreams begin to take shape, carrying you to places both strange and familiar. There is comfort in the ordinary, magic in the mundane. Tonight, you've tasted that magic, one bite at a time. Good night, and sweet dreams.